That Vance burned his housemaid's freedom papers and told her she would be sold down river by morning. He thought a woman in chains had no way to strike back at a man in a mansion. But he forgot one thing. His wife's vanity was the most dangerous room in the house, and a single jar of face powder was about to strip the skin from his lies. By the time the sun rose, the mistress would lose her face, and the master would lose his empire to the very documents he tried to hide. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of how a woman used the very tools of her oppression to burn a man's world to the ground. The air in Louisiana in 1852 didn't just sit on you. It pressed against your lungs like a wet wool blanket. Inside the Vance mansion, the air was even heavier. It smelled of expensive French perfume, stale tobacco, and the copper tang of fear. Elodia stood in the library, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the orange glow of the fireplace. In the Vance's hand was a single sheet of parchment. It was the only thing Elodia truly owned. It was her manumission, signed by the previous master of the estate, granting her freedom upon his death. But the old master was gone, and the Vance was the law now. He didn't say a word as he dropped the paper into the heart of the coals. Elodia watched the edges curl. She watched the ink of her own name blacken and disappear. The fire didn't care about the law. It didn't care about the years of service or the promise made to a dying man. The Corey Vance finally looked up, a thin, oily smile stretching across his face. He told her she was no longer a person. To him, she was just currency. He had gambling debts that reached from New Orleans to Natchez, and Elodia was a high-value asset. He told her the traders would be at the back gate by dawn. She was to be sold to a labor camp in the swamps, a place where people went in and never came out. That thought he had won. He thought that by burning that paper, he had erased Elodia's future. What he didn't realize was that Elodia had a memory like a steel trap. She didn't just read her freedom papers. She had read every document that had passed across his desk for the last 6 months. She knew why the master was desperate. She knew about the forged signatures and the stolen land deeds. And she knew that in this house, the most powerful weapon wasn't a pistol or a whip. It was the white powder in the blue porcelain jar on Mistress Coraline's vanity. Look at this. Some people called this the golden age of the South, but it was nothing but a cage built out of stolen lives and paper lies. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. Elodia moved through the hallways like a shadow. She had been the housemaid for 10 years. She knew every creak in the floorboards and every secret hidden behind the wallpaper. Her first stop wasn't her own small room to pack a bag. She knew she couldn't run. The dogs would find her before she reached the river. No, if she was going to survive, she had to stay and fight. She headed toward the master's study. The Corey Vance was a man who lived on the edge of a knife. To the neighbors, he was a pillar of the community. To the widows whose land he had quietly absorbed, he was a savior who helped them manage their affairs. But Elodia had seen the truth. She had seen him practicing the governor's signature late at night, the candle stub burning low as he traced the elegant loops over and over. She had seen the way his hands shook when the mail arrived. She stepped into the study. The smell of bourbon was thick. The Corey Vance was likely in the parlor, drinking away the last of his nerves before the slave traders arrived.
Elodia's eyes went straight to the desk. She didn't have much time. She began to sift through the papers, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. She wasn't looking for money. She was looking for the weight. She had noticed months ago that the master's wife, Coraline, had a travel vanity case that was far too heavy for its size. Coraline complained about it constantly, blaming the cheap silver plating, but Elodia knew better. In the corner of the desk, she found a stack of land transfer documents. They looked official. They had the seals and the ribbons, but Elodia's photographic memory caught the floor instantly. The governor's seal was slightly off-center. The ink was a shade too dark. These were the forgeries Thackeray was using to pay off his debts. But where were the originals? The real deeds, the ones that proved the land still belonged to the widows of the parish, were the only things that could send Thackeray to the gallows. She heard a floorboard groan in the hallway. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She blew out the candle and ducked behind the heavy velvet curtains. The door opened. The heavy, uneven footsteps told her it was Thackeray. He was drunk. He stumbled toward the desk, muttering to himself about one more win in the Red River. He fumbled with a drawer, locked it, and then collapsed into his chair. Elodia held her breath. She could smell the tobacco on him from 3 feet away. He stayed there for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Elodia waited until the sound of his footsteps faded into the upstairs carpet. She didn't go back to the desk. She knew now that the secrets weren't in the drawers. They were in the one place no one would ever look, the mistress's bedroom. Mistress Coraline was a woman defined by her vanity. She was 20 years younger than Thackeray and twice as cruel. She treated Elodia like a piece of furniture, a foot tool to be kicked when the mood struck. Coraline's world revolved around her porcelain skin. She was terrified of the sun, terrified of age, and obsessed with the latest beauty trends from Paris. Her most prized possession was a blue porcelain jar with a heavy silver lid. It sat on her vanity, filled with a fine white face powder that she applied 5 times a day. To Coraline, that powder was beauty. To Elodia, it was the key to a chemical reaction. Before she was brought to this plantation, Elodia had worked for an apothecary in New Orleans. She knew the properties of minerals. She knew what happened when certain substances met moisture. And she knew that the laundry room held a large supply of lye crystals used for making soap and stripping the grease from the heavy cooking pots. Elodia slipped into the servants' staircase and made her way down to the wash house. The night was humid, the kind of heat that made you sweat just by standing still. She found the heavy wooden bucket of lye. It looked innocent enough, white, crystalline, almost like sugar, but if you touched it with wet hands, it would eat through your skin in seconds. She took a small leather pouch from her apron and filled it with the crystals. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization of what she was about to do. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about timing. The governor's ball was scheduled for the following night. It was the biggest social event of the year, the place where Thackeray intended to finalize his land deals, and where Coraline intended to be the envy of every woman in the state. Elodia returned to the main house. She had to get into the mistress's room while she was asleep. It was a risk that would mean a public whipping if she was caught, but she had nothing left to lose. Thackeray had already promised her the whip and the chain by morning. She crept into the master's suite. The sound of the rhythmic snoring came from the bed, but Coraline was in her separate dressing room, sprawled on a chaise longue, her face covered in a thick layer of grease to preserve her complexion. Elodia didn't look at them. She went straight for the vanity. The blue porcelain jar was there. She lifted the silver lid. The scent of roses filled the air, a sickeningly sweet smell that masked the rot of the house. Elodia pulled the pouch of lye from her apron. She began to mix the crystals into the powder. She had to be precise. If there were too many crystals, Coraline might feel the sting immediately. If there were too few, the effect wouldn't be dramatic enough. She needed a slow burn. She needed the lye to wait until Coraline was under the hot lights of the ballroom, until the sweat of the dance began to dissolve the crystals and turn the powder into a caustic paste. As she stirred the mixture with a small bone spatula, her hand slipped. A few crystals spilled on the marble top of the vanity. Elodia panicked. She reached out to wipe them away, forgetting for a split second that her palms were damp with the humidity of the night. A sharp, searing pain shot up her thumb. She hissed, biting her lip to keep from screaming. She watched as a small red welt rose on her skin instantly. The lye was working. She wiped her hand on her apron and cleaned the marble with a dry cloth, her heart racing. But then she noticed something else. The vanity case, the heavy one Coraline traveled with, was sitting right next to the jar. In the moonlight, Elodia saw a thin line along the bottom of the case that didn't match the grain of the wood. It was a false bottom. She reached out and felt the weight of it.
It was lopsided. This was it. This was where Thackeray hid the truth. He used his wife's obsession with her belongings to hide the very evidence that could destroy him. He knew no one would dare touch the mistress's personal vanity. It was the perfect hiding spot because it was protected by the arrogance of the family. Just as Elodia reached for the latch of the false bottom, a voice cut through the dark. "What are you doing in here?" Elodia froze. The silver lid of the powder jar was still in her left hand. The leather pouch of lye crystals was in her right. She turned slowly. Mistress Coraline was sitting up on the chaise longue, her eyes narrow and suspicious, the grease on her face shining like a mask of death in the moonlight. Elodia stood frozen, the silver lid of the powder jar feeling like a cold coin pressed against her palm. In her other hand, the leather pouch of lye crystals was a heavy, hidden secret. Mistress Coraline sat up, her face slick with grease, looking like a pale ghost in the moonlight. Her eyes weren't filled with sleep, they were filled with the sharp, jagged suspicion of a woman who trusted no one because she herself was a lie. Coraline didn't ask what Elodia was doing. She demanded to know why a piece of property was touching her most intimate possessions. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the mosquitoes buzzing against the window screens outside. Elodia's mind raced. If she dropped the pouch, the sound of the crystals hitting the floor would give her away. If she tucked it into her apron, Coraline would see the movement. The master was snoring in the next room, but Coraline's voice was a knife, and it was cutting through the air. Elodia lowered her head, the practiced move of a woman who had learned that looking a monster in the eye was the fastest way to get whipped. She whispered that the lid had looked tarnished in the moonlight, and she had only wanted to polish it so the mistress would look perfect for the governor's ball. It was a gamble. It played directly into Coraline's vanity, the one thing more powerful than her cruelty. Coraline narrowed her eyes, leaning forward. The smell of the rose-scented powder and the sharp metallic sting of the lye crystals created a suffocating cloud between them. Coraline reached out a thin, bony hand and snatched the silver lid. She inspected it, her lip curling. Then she looked at the open porcelain jar. She asked why the powder looked disturbed, why it looked like someone had been digging in it.
Elijah felt to the sweat trickling down her spine. The lye on her thumb was starting to eat into the skin, a quiet, invisible fire. She told the mistress that the powder had clumped from the humidity, and she was simply smoothing it out so it wouldn't streak on her skin. Coraline's eyes flickered. She was a woman obsessed with her own reflection, and the thought of a streak was more terrifying to her than any slave suffering, but she wasn't convinced. She told Elodia to prove it. She ordered her to take the brush and apply some of that powder to her own arm. This was the moment the trap could have snapped shut on Elodia's neck. If she put that powder on her skin, the sweat from her fear would activate the lie immediately. She would scream and the game would be over. But Elodia had spent 10 years watching this woman. She knew that Coraline kept a secondary clean brush hidden in the side drawer for emergencies. While Coraline was busy admiring the silver lid, Elodia's fingers moved with a ghost's touch. She didn't use the brush in the jar. She grabbed the clean, dry brush from the drawer, swept it over the very top layer of the powder where the lye hadn't been mixed in yet, and brushed it across her dark forearm. The white powder sat on her skin like dust. It didn't burn. Not yet. There wasn't enough moisture, and she had picked from the clean surface. Coraline watched her like a hawk watching a mouse. When no welts appeared, the mistress finally relaxed, though she didn't apologize. She never apologized. She told Elodia to get out, but not before ordering her to have the travel vanity case ready by the door. Coraline said the master was nervous, and they might have to leave for New Orleans earlier than expected. Elodia backed out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would bruise. She retreated to the hallway, the lye pouch still clutched in her hand. She had survived the encounter, but the clock was ticking. Their advance was planning an early departure. That meant he was scared. A scared man is a dangerous man, and Elodia knew that if the slave traders arrived before the ball, her plan would die with her. She made her way to the small, cramped space under the stairs where she slept. She sat in the dark, her thumb throbbing. The burn was small,
but it was deep. It was a reminder of what she was playing with. She thought about the heavy vanity case. She knew the original deeds were in that false bottom. Their Vance didn't trust banks, and he certainly didn't trust his partners in crime. He kept the evidence of his forgeries close, hidden under his wife's perfumes and powders. If Elodia could get those deeds into the hands of someone who couldn't be bought, someone like Dr. Ariston, the Vance empire would crumble. But Dr. Ariston was a man of science, not a man of revolution. He was the only doctor in the parish who would treat the enslaved and the masters alike. But he stayed out of politics. He would need a reason to look inside that vanity. He would need a medical reason. And that was exactly what the blue porcelain jar was for. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the walls, the sound of heavy wagon wheels echoed in the courtyard. Elodia's blood turned to ice. The slave traders weren't supposed to be there until noon. Their Vance had moved the timeline. He was clearing his debts earlier than he said. She heard the master's voice downstairs, rough and growly, barking orders to the stable hand. Elodia didn't have hours. She had minutes. She had to get that powder jar into the travel case, and she had to make sure Coraline used it. But more than that, she had to ensure that when the disease struck, it happened in front of the right people. Their Vance burst into the kitchen 10 minutes later. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His clothes were wrinkled and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked at Elodia, not as a human being, but as a check he was about to cash. He told her the traitor, a man named Miller, known for his brutality, was waiting at the gate. He told her to gather her things, which meant nothing more than the clothes on her back. Elodia didn't beg. She didn't cry. She knew that would only give him satisfaction. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye and told him that the mistress's vanity case wasn't packed yet. She told him that Coraline was insisting on taking the special French powder, and that if it wasn't handled carefully, the porcelain would break, and the mistress would make his life a living hell all the way to New Orleans. Their Vance paused. He hated his wife's tantrums more than he hated his own debts. He cursed, his face turning a deep, angry purple. He told Elodia she had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to finish with the mistress, or he would drag her to the trader's wagon by her hair. Elodia ran back upstairs. The house was a whirlwind of activity. Servants were carrying trunks, and the air was filled with the smell of scorched coffee and anxiety. She entered the dressing room. Coraline was already dressed in a heavy silk traveling gown. Despite the sweltering heat, she was snapping at a younger girl who was trying to lace her boots. Elodia grabbed the blue porcelain jar. She didn't just place it in the vanity case, she wedged it firmly right above the false bottom. She felt the weight of the deeds underneath. They were right there, inches away. If she could just reach down and grab them, she could run. But where would she go? A black woman running with land deeds would be hanged before she reached the county line. No, the truth had to come out in a way that their Vance couldn't explain away. It had to be a public execution of his reputation. She closed the vanity case and locked it. The heavy silver key felt like a lead weight. She handed it to Coraline. The mistress looked at her with a sneer, telling her that she was lucky the master was selling her. Coraline said she was tired of looking at Elodia's sour face. What Coraline didn't realize was that her own face was about to become the site of a chemical war. The powder was settled deep in the powder. Now the vibration of the carriage ride would mix it even further, and the heat of the New Orleans ballroom, combined with the heavy layers of silk and the sweat of the dance, would do the rest. As Elodia was led down the back steps toward the trader's wagon, she saw Kujoya by the stables. The old man looked at her, his face a mask of sorrow. He had provided the lie, knowing what it was for, but he didn't think she would actually get caught in the middle of it. Elodia gave him a single sharp nod. She wasn't finished. The trader, Miller, a man known for his brutality, grabbed Elodia's arm with a grip that made her bones groan. He tossed her into the back of a barred wagon, where 3 other men were already in chains. Their van stood on the porch, lighting a cigar, watching his debt being hauled away. He looked relieved. He thought he had buried his secrets. He thought he had silenced the only witness to his forgeries. But as the wagon began to pull away,
Elodia looked back at the house. She saw the carriage being readied for the master and mistress. She saw the vanity case being loaded onto the back. She knew that in a few hours they would be at the governor's ball. She knew that Coraline would reach for that blue jar. She knew the sweat would start to pour, and she knew that no matter how far the traitor took her, the scream that was coming from New Orleans would be loud enough to break the chains. The powder didn't just contain lie, it contained the end of the Vance name. The only question now was whether Elodia would be alive to see the smoke rise from the ruins. The governor's ballroom in New Orleans was a furnace of high society greed, draped in silk and lit by the hissing glow of gaslights, while Elodia sat in the back of a barred wagon, her wrists chafed by iron. Mistress Coraline was preparing for her greatest performance. She stood in front of the mirror in a private dressing room at the mansion, her skin coated in a thick white layer of the powder from the blue porcelain jar. She looked like a marble statue, cold and untouchable. She didn't feel the slight prickle on her cheeks yet. She thought it was just the excitement, the heat of the city, or the weight of her heavy emerald earrings. But the lie was there, settled into the pores of her skin, waiting for the one thing that would turn it into a weapon. Sweat. Their Vance stood by the door, checking his pocket watch. He was a man who had successfully erased his past by burning a piece of paper, and now he was ready to secure his future with a pen. He had the forged land deeds in his pocket, ready to be handed over to a group of investors once the dancing began. He looked at his wife and felt a surge of pride. She was the perfect distraction. No one looks at a man's ledger when his wife is the most beautiful woman in the room. He told her to hurry. The violins were already starting, and the governor was waiting.
The ballroom was packed. Over 300 people moved in a synchronized swirl of lace and wool. The temperature inside was rising by the minute. Coraline was led to the center of the floor by a young colonel. As the music swelled, she began to dance. The movement was vigorous. Within 10 minutes, a thin film of moisture began to form on her forehead. The sweat mixed with the white powder, dissolving the lye crystals Elodia had carefully stirred into the jar. The chemical reaction was silent and invisible at first, but then the prickle turned into a sting. The sting turned into a bite. Coraline missed a step. She felt a sudden sharp heat spreading across her cheekbones. She tried to maintain her smile, but her skin felt like it was being poked by 1,000 red-hot needles. She reached up to touch her face, and her gloved finger came away with a smear of white paste and a piece of her own skin. She didn't scream yet. She was too proud. She thought it was an allergic reaction, a temporary blemish. She looked toward Thackeray, who was leaning against a pillar, laughing with the governor. She tried to signal him, but the pain was becoming an agony she couldn't ignore. The lie was now a caustic sludge eating through the grease, through the epidermis, and deep into the living tissue beneath. A small wisp of white smoke, actually a chemical vapor, rose from her hairline. The woman dancing next to her stopped and pointed. A man gasped. The music faltered as Coraline finally let out a sound that didn't belong in a ballroom. It was a raw, guttural shriek of a wounded animal. She fell to her knees, clawing at her face, her fingernails tearing away chunks of the white powder and the blackened skin underneath. The crowd parted like she was a leper. Thackeray ran toward her, his face pale. He didn't see a suffering wife. He saw a public scandal that would bring the law down on his house. He tried to grab her arms, to pull her away into a side room where he could hide the damage. He told her to shut up, his voice a frantic whisper. He tried to cover her face with his coat, but Coraline was beyond reason. She was fighting for her life against an invisible fire. "Step back! Move away from her!" The voice belonged to Dr. Ariston. He pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already in hand. He didn't ask for permission. He knelt beside Coraline and grabbed her wrists. He smelled the sharp, acrid scent of the chemical burn immediately. He looked at Thackeray, his eyes hard as flint. He asked what she had put on her face. Thackeray stammered, claiming it was just standard makeup, just a French powder. But the doctor wasn't a fool.
He took a silk handkerchief, dipped it into a glass of water from a nearby table, and wiped a small patch of Coraline's forehead. The cloth came away yellowed and smoking. He turned to the governor, who was watching in horror. The doctor declared that this wasn't a disease, it was a chemical attack. He demanded to see the source. He demanded the vanity case. Thackeray Vance realized the walls were closing in. He tried to claim the vanity case was back at the hotel, but the governor, now suspicious of the man who had been pressuring him to sign land transfers all evening, ordered the carriage to be brought around. The vanity case was found in the boot of the carriage and brought into the ballroom. The room was silent as the doctor placed the case on a marble table. He opened the lid. The blue porcelain jar was sitting right there, its silver lid slightly askew. The doctor didn't touch the powder with his bare hands. He used a silver spoon to scoop some out and drop it into the water. The water began to boil instantly. The proof was undeniable. But as the doctor moved the jar to inspect the rest of the case, he noticed the lopsided weight Elodia had felt the night before. He ran his fingers along the velvet lining. He felt the hollow click of a false bottom. Thackeray tried to lunge for the case, but two of the governor's guards grabbed his arms. He screamed that it was private property, that they had no right. The doctor pulled the hidden lever. The false bottom popped open. A stack of original land deeds fell onto the marble table. These weren't the forgeries Thackeray had in his pocket. These were the real documents, bearing the authentic seals of the parish widows and the original owners. At the bottom of the stack was a small charred scrap of paper, a corner of Elodia's freedom papers that hadn't fully burned in the fireplace, which she had managed to hide in the case during the final packing as a silent testimony. The governor picked up the deeds. He looked at Thackeray, then at the smoking, disfigured face of Coraline, and then at the documents. The forgery was revealed in the most public way possible. Thackeray Vance wasn't just a bankrupt gambler. He was a thief who had defrauded the state. The scandal broke the Vance name in a single hour, while Coraline was carried away to a clinic where she would spend the rest of her life behind a heavy veil. Thackeray was led out of the ballroom in chains. He didn't go to a debtor's prison. He went to the state penitentiary for high forgery and aggravated assault. But what about Elodia? The news of the scandal hit the slave markets by dawn. The trader Miller was a man of profit, not loyalty. When he heard that his client, Thackeray Vance, had been arrested and his assets seized by the state, he knew the sale was dead. The law was coming to inventory every piece of property in the Vance estate. Miller didn't want to be caught with stolen or disputed assets. In the confusion of the legal seizure at the New Orleans docks, Elodia didn't wait for a judge to decide her fate. She knew where Thackeray kept his emergency gold, inside the lining of his traveling coat, which had been tossed into the wagon during the arrest. She took the gold, she took the forged papers she had kept as leverage, and she disappeared into the fog of the Mississippi River. By the time the sun was fully up, the Vance mansion was empty. The blue porcelain jar was sitting in a sheriff's evidence locker, a silent witness to the vanity that destroyed an empire. The stolen land was eventually returned to the widows, and the name Thackeray Vance became a cautionary tale whispered in the drawing rooms of Louisiana. Thackeray thought he could burn a woman's future and hide behind a wife's beauty. He learned too late that a house built on lies cannot stand the heat of the truth. Elodia was never seen in Louisiana again, but some say a woman with a scarred thumb and a deep knowledge of chemistry opened a shop in Philadelphia years later, selling a very specific kind of face powder that never ever left a mark. The truth is like lye. It eats through every mask eventually, and it doesn't care who is wearing it.